Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to address you this evening. It's been a fascinating, different range of speakers and lecture topics that you have brought together. And I'm going to try in 30 minutes or so to give you quite a grand overview, really, of my view, shared by most of our thinkers at the Institute of Economic Affairs, about why a very radical free market approach is what I believe Britain needs today in order to have a better future. So I'm going to paint a picture of a future Britain that is a genuinely free market Britain, one which goes far beyond what I hope to persuade you are the relatively trivial and tactical changes to public expenditure actually being conducted by the coalition government. I want to see a Britain in which the size of the state is cut at least in half from its present level, in which taxation is very radically reduced, in which businesses and people are both set free. And I believe that very basic economic theory, which I hope to be able to illustrate in some entertaining fashion for you this evening, and indeed crushing empirical evidence from across the globe since the end of the Second World War, shows that there is no doubt that this would be the way to create a more prosperous, much happier, much healthier Britain. In short, I don't believe that there is an attractive or obvious third way. I don't believe that we have, after years of experimenting, somehow stumbled across, or indeed perfectly honed, a brilliantly mixed economy in which we have the best possible elements of state influence and private influence. I don't believe that we have got that alchemic mix right. It's my assertion that in nearly all circumstances, in virtually every area of our lives, we need a smaller state, a cheaper state, and a bigger, greater role for the private sector and for private citizens. I'm also going to assert that we need to be more fully aware of the near disastrous economic situation which has now arisen in the United Kingdom. Although, as I say arisen, I mean created. This has not been an act of God. We have got ourselves to the position we find ourselves in owing to a substantial number, largely of public policy decisions conducted by politicians that we have elected. I'm going to argue not just that this is a potentially dangerous situation, but that it has very long-term, potentially negative consequences for the United Kingdom unless we go far beyond the trivial cuts in expenditure envisaged at present, and indeed has a very disturbing moral consequences and issues surrounding it, in terms of those who are of voting age today, effectively expecting our children and our grandchildren to pay for our excesses in years to come. And I would say that if you are concerned about climate change and global warming, if you are concerned about the environmental legacy that we are leaving for the next generation, if this troubles you one bit or one iota, then you should be utterly apoplectic about the financial legacy that we are leaving behind for generations to come. But firstly, I need to say a few words about what we roughly mean as a free economy. I don't want to take up too much time about this, but I'm using the economic measures that are used by the Heritage Foundation, which every year produces its Freedom Index. What do we mean? How do we try and measure if an economy is free? This is, I hesitate to say, not a perfect science. There are some contestable assertions in here, but I think that this would be a broadly acceptable definition along the following indicators. Firstly, we mean business freedom. That's the ability to set up and run a business with minimal regulatory interference or costs. We mean trade freedom, openness to trade from across the world, a lack of tariffs, a lack of import barriers, etc. Fiscal freedom, the extent to which individuals and businesses are permitted to keep and spend their own money rather than it being taxed and used by the government. Freedom from government, a government spending measure. What is the ratio of government public sector spending to GDP? The lower, the freer the economy, we would assert. Monetary freedom, the extent to which monetary policy is used to fight inflation, maintain price stability, and preserve the nation's wealth, largely relying on market prices. Investment freedom, openness to foreign investment, limited or no restrictions on cross-border capital inflows and outflows. Financial freedom, the existence of a transparent financial system driven by supply and demand, regulated by disclosure requirements and independent auditing, property rights, the ability to accumulate private property and have it protected through the force of law, freedom from corruption, so a limited or no existence of corrupt government officials and cartel-like businesses, and finally, labour freedom, the ability of individuals to work as much as they want, whenever they want, for any wage they can agree. The Heritage Foundation attempts to measure for around 200 countries how free those countries are across those spread of metrics. I should say there in large part, we are only measuring economic freedom at this point, your ability to practice your chosen religion freely or to express your own political ideas freely. Those aren't included in these economic measures. This is only measuring your economic freedom. And the Heritage Foundation, this is, I hope, actually one of the most complex graphs I'm going to show you, came up with this. This shows the countries measured, and along the bottom axis is the economic freedom score. 100 would be a perfectly free society. Nobody has managed to achieve that. And across the top axis is GDP per capita in US dollars, measured in at 2000 level of the value of the US dollar. The correlation isn't perfect at 0.67, but it is startling. In short, in economic terms, the freer you are, the richer your people are. There is not a trade-off to diminish freedom in order to improve the wealth, the income of your country. The very bottom five are Afghanistan, Sudan, North Korea, Zimbabwe and Eritrea, and the ones towards the very top right of the graph are Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand and Switzerland, rated to be the freest countries by the Heritage Foundation. But in order to reinforce this point, and without going into the precise details of the freedom or lack of it in a range of different societies, I wanted to compare a number of different countries and how they've performed since 1950. And I think that there are lessons to be learned here. I should just say, because this is from a different set of statistics, I'll be now measuring things in 2005 US dollar terms. This line here, the green line here, shows the performance of Hong Kong since 1950. And when I say the performance, what I mean is the GDP per capita, effectively the average income of a Hong Kong citizen. It has increased in 1950, notwithstanding a recent dip that you can see there in 2008, around the time of the global financial crisis. It is increased by a factor of approximately 10 since 1950. The United Kingdom, shown by that brown line, not an appalling record, not by any means. We are doing better off year on year. You sometimes wouldn't believe this from the media and political narrative you hear, but we have generally steadily got richer. Again, notwithstanding the recent the dip that you can see just at the end there, but slow and steady progress. But you can see in contrast to Hong Kong, having started out in 1950 with each British citizen in broad terms about 3 times as well off as the average citizen in Hong Kong. The average Hong Kong citizen is now about 35% or so richer than the average Brit. We have not just been caught, we have been quite spectacularly surpassed. The Republic of Korea is that blue line. Fairly impressive growth, certainly since 1980, and from, well, I suppose everybody are measuring from a standing start, but from a position of staggering poverty in 1950 in relation to the United Kingdom. Certainly hasn't caught us up, not as rich as the UK, but from a position of the ratio of the average Brit being about 20 times, having about 20 times as much income as the average South Korean. The ratio is now something like 3 to 2. Hong Kong and South Korea have performed spectacularly against us. Switzerland there is in dark blue, the United States of America in the purpley colour at the top, finishing again, albeit with that dip above everybody else. Growth not dissimilar in terms of the improvement of national income to the United Kingdom, not showing the same sort of gradients and trajectories that you see in Hong Kong. If you wanted to take countries which are very broadly in the sort of average level of wealth, that's Brazil on that dark purple, royal purple line, and Bosnia and Herzegovina in the bluer, the aqua line underneath. And if you want a lesson on how not to do things, that red line is Zimbabwe, and the green line above it is North Korea. Again, I haven't got into all the details about how free or deregulated or liberalised those economies are, but I think those are some pretty startling statistics from the last 60 years, if you are concerned about the average income of each citizen in your country. It is pretty clear which sort of roadmap you wish to follow. It is not a disaster to be like the UK, Switzerland, or the United States. It is eminently preferable to be like Hong Kong or South Korea. It is unimpressive to be like Brazil or Bosnia, and it is catastrophic to be like Zimbabwe or North Korea. On a direct comparison, and I appreciate that these are, if you like, two very extreme examples I'm going to use here, two very different systems, but it can often be said that, well, comparisons with Hong Kong or Singapore don't really work. They're tiny little city-states. You can't compare them to the United States of America or the UK. You can't possibly compare the UK and India. It does seem to me relatively fair play to compare two countries on exactly the same peninsula that have had extremely different paths since 1950. You couldn't say that they have all things the same. They're not identical in terms of population. They're not exactly identical in terms of natural resources, but it's a pretty good, a closer mix as you're going to get. And that's the Republic of Korea, South Korea, going from a little less than $1,000 per head of population in 1950 to getting towards $25,000 now, and that's North Korea. Virtually, despite a little bit of a jump in the 60s, basically virtually no growth in average national income whatsoever. I'm just going to play a clip now from a documentary film which came out last November and was screened on Channel 4 called Britain's £1 Trillion Horror Story. I'm going to use 2 or 3 clips from it in this presentation, because I think that this clip does explain and expose a certain degree of schizophrenia that we have in the United Kingdom about the role of government, and when we want government to provide services and products, we believe there's a certain area in which we believe the government does that well, but we don't actually apply the same reasoning to many of the things we value in our day-to-day lives, and many of the things that we would be horrified if the government began to provide.
The idea that we need state monopolies in order to look after the poor is obviously untrue.
We make sure poor people in Britain have shoes and clothes and food, but we don't have state shoe shops and state clothes shops and government canteens. Can you imagine how awful that would be?
In fact, in our state health and education system, the poor do especially badly.
It's the articulate, pushy middle classes who manage to see the consultant and get their kids into the one decent state school in the area. Excuse me, you've put skimmed milk in my latte. People say you can't possibly privatise health and education because private firms will be in it to make a profit. But we're surrounded by wonderful things made by companies who need to make a profit. Do we say, we can't have a washing machine made by Bosch or Zanussi because they make a profit? Much better to have a washing machine made by the state. Let's not get a Toyota, they're in it for the money. Much wiser to wait in a queue for a government-made Trabant.
I think what Martin Durkin, the presenter, does tease out there is that actually, when we look through our lives, we accept that the free market economy and capitalism is usually the best way for furnishing us with the best quality products, sometimes at the cheapest price, but certainly the best quality products, and we would be horrified if relatively important items that we rely on in our lives, a car and a washing machine not being a bad example, were provided by the state. But of course we often, I don't, but the majority of the British population believe that there are some areas so crucial that we have to rely on the state to provide them. Our health, our welfare benefits when we need them, education and so forth. And in fact, those three areas, health, education and welfare, and I'm including in welfare incapacity benefit, your state pension, unemployment benefits related to unemployment, etc., account for approximately 55 or 60% of the overall government spending. It is colossally the largest part of government spending in this country. So how much are we actually spending in the United Kingdom? How big is our government? Well, this graph shows that whole blue bar or the blue line, what proportion of GDP the state has been spending from 1900 to 2010. You can see the two colossal peaks when we go way beyond even 50% of GDP being spent by the state, but for relatively understandable circumstances in those two periods of time, we were engaged in all-out world wars. You can see another peak in the middle of the 1970s, extremely bleak times for the British economy. That expenditure then from about 1980 onwards starts to not come down, but come down as a proportion of our GDP until, as you can see, over the last few years, it has crept up substantially again and is getting towards that 45% margin. Not in the context of us fighting an all-out war with the Germans, just in the context of our spending easing up in peacetime. This graph here compares two things. The red line shows government spending as a proportion of GDP, and the black line shows our GDP in millions of pounds. The reason I just show that is that I don't believe this is conclusive evidence against the proposition, but I believe it is some evidence against the proposition that if you wish to increase GDP, namely that black line, it is not obvious that you do so by increasing government spending. You do not see the government spending, the red line going up, pushing GDP upwards. I mean, if anything, there's something of a negative correlation between government spending and GDP. It's not absolutely conclusive proof, but it is, I think, some evidence against those who say, let's get our GDP up by actually increasing the size of the state. And what it means in real cash terms, I was born in 1972, so this graph actually starts in 1970, in the 70 to 71 financial year, just before I was born. The government in 1970 to 71 spent almost exactly £200 billion, and today we are spending somewhere around £700 billion every year. That is to say, in the course of my lifetime, government spending in real terms, this is inflation adjusted, has increased by a factor of around 3.5. So do we believe that this is a route that we should continue to go down, or can we actually learn from a freer market economy such as Hong Kong? Let's see what Martin Durkin thinks.
John Cowperthwaite knew that lower tax meant higher profits, that higher profits meant more growth, and that more growth meant more jobs and higher wages. Before Cowperthwaite, Hong Kongers were about a third as rich as the British. Today, GDP per capita here is a third again higher.
The odd thing is, back in 1960, say, the average Hong Konger would have probably given their right arm for the chance to live in Sunderland. Nowadays, I suspect they'd regard it as a prison sentence.
Birds singing in the sycamore tree.
A small state and low taxes did for Hong Kong exactly what they had done for Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, and news soon spread across the region. The Asian economic miracle had begun.